course, when it comes to operating in Zambia, First Quantum Minerals is amongst the companies rattled by the fluctuations we've seen in the country's tax regime. And joining me for conversation now is Matt Pascall. He's Director of Operations at the company. Thanks so much, Matt, for your time today. So how are you rating sentiment amongst mining companies right now, given the drop back in taxes and the fact that the ministry is looking at potentially further cuts moving forward?
I mean, it's obviously of concern to us that there have been so many changes over the last 5 years. And mining investments are long-term, and one needs a stable environment in which to operate to warrant those long-term investments. What is heartening at the moment is that there is an atmosphere and a willingness to have dialogue and see if we can get to a position where the taxes go back into where they are competitive worldwide and that they are conducive to making those long-term investments. So the spirit of dialogue is definitely very welcome at the moment.
The spirit of dialogue, and perhaps that's what it hinges on, looking at this road forward, because comments have come through that those increased taxes have been deferred as opposed to ruled out completely. Are you nervous at all? To what extent are you nervous?
It's not good for mining people to be nervous. It's a game for the big guys, as it were, or the tough guys. It's disconcerting when you have too many changes and fluctuations. And generally it's been ratcheting upwards, which is not only disconcerting, but obviously at some point is a disencouragement to making investments because the return just simply isn't there. I think nervous isn't the right term, and I think we've probably gone through the worst, and hopefully we're now in a situation where there's a reasonable level of understanding of where the mines are and what their problems are, and therefore the opportunity to get to a tax regime which is, as I say, competitive and fair.
You alluded to weighing up returns, and when you do something like that, of course you look at the business and your operations, the costs that come to bear, and government came at you for layoffs implemented after the completion for Project Kansanshi. How difficult is it doing business in Zambia right now and shifting to the economic realities and economic pressures as they come to bear so that you still stand as a viable business entity?
Obviously employment is one of the critical areas that any government is concerned about. However, unfortunately, projects by their very nature do come to an end, and therefore people who are working on projects have to live with the reality that at some point the project ends. As somebody said yesterday, if you have contractors come in and build the house for you, when the house is complete, they don't live in the house with you, they actually have to move on. The key thing is to try and create an environment which encourages further investment and therefore future projects as well, so that those people who become skilled in project work can move from one project to another. And obviously the operating concern that you're left with at Kansanshi, which in this case was the smelter, is only viable if it runs with the right number of people. It can't employ the whole of Zambia. And so one sizes it up accordingly. And I think there is a pretty high degree of, there's always some rhetoric around layoffs and so on. But I think the understanding is there that projects are temporary and one has to live with those. And while there might be a flare-up in the press for a short time, reality does come home.
You recently raised capital in the markets, $1.1 billion to pay down debt and accelerate development in your pipeline of copper projects. But the deal raised questions about the health of your Zambian operations overall. That the sourcing of external capital funding suggests there could be more risks in your Zambian operations. What's your response to comment like that?
I really think that the Zambian operations don't play a role in that decision at all. We're quite happy that the Zambian operations function well and are self-sustaining. Obviously, more relevant is the copper price regime that we're now entering, which is relatively low, and therefore one's not achieving the same sort of returns that one was a few years ago. And all that money raising was to strengthen the balance sheet. We're in a big construction phase, particularly in Panama, and it's important that one does the right things to make sure that that project's not jeopardized from a cash flow perspective. But it really doesn't. It's not an issue of the Zambian operations at all.
So what kind of capital are you committing to Zambia specifically? What level of capex are you looking to deploy in the country?
Well, at the moment, we're really just looking at sustaining capital. And in the mining industry, that's quite a significant amount of money that one does have to put into operations just to keep production at the same levels. Because the assets decline, or the physical plant declines, but also typically the grades at which you're mining decline. So to get the same level of copper production, you have to keep expanding the plant and so on, literally just to stay still. So at the moment, the sustaining, our major capital projects are complete, which is Sentinel Mine and the smelter at Kansanshi. Other than that, it's really sustaining capital, and we'll review the need for any further major capital based on the fiscal environment and the development of the mines as a whole as we go forward.
And one assumes the power situation in the country as well. I mean, talk us through that and how you're managing the power crunch that the country faces, because you've been mulling a $1.5 billion power plant in Botswana to power your Zambian operations. Is that your only option in navigating around the challenge? And is it necessarily the answer, ramping up your own power supply?
Well, fortunately, Zambia actually, of probably all the countries in Africa, has the best power supply situation. And fortunately, a lot of that is hydro. And there are other hydro projects in the pipeline, such as Teshi Teshi, which will improve the situation. There's also Nava Barat building a thermal power station, which will come onto the grid. So in the short term, Zambia is actually, although it's tight, it's a lot better than most other countries in Africa. Again, the question you ask about Botswana, really one needs to just be sure that going forward in the longer term, because we're talking about projects that run for the next 20 or 30 years, that power supply in the sub-region, really, because the South African power pool makes it possible to introduce power at any point in that and take power off at any other point. So we're really just looking at some way of safeguarding the long-term power environment.
In line with investing in your own infrastructure, President Lungu has quite a focus on companies expanding on corporate social responsibilities into non-traditional areas, so investing in your broader infrastructure base, roads, rail. What role do you see private sector playing in that regard?
Well, quite honestly, the tax rates in Zambia are high, and as a company, First Quantum has now paid over $3 billion in various taxes in Zambia. And I mean, the short answer would be that really that's the responsibility of government. However, we are very cognizant of the fact that the communities in which we live, particularly in the Northwest Province, have been left on the back burner over the past decades. And therefore, for them to feel happy to have us there as a partner, an investor in the area, we've definitely done a lot of work with the local community. And we've directed most of our CSR spend into education and health. We have done a lot of work on roads and built the airport at Solwezi and things like that. But those things can deteriorate in time. Education you can't take away from anybody. And so our feeling is that if you concentrate on health and education, you actually leave a legacy where hopefully the future generations will know the wisdom of keeping that infrastructure in good condition and being able to sustain something after the mines have closed.
Well, let's leave it there. Matt, thanks so much for your time today. A pleasure chatting to you. Of course, Matt Pascall is Director of Operations at First Quantum Minerals.